So welcome everybody back to our channel here at Asheville Vedic Astrology. I've got a special guest today, John Marchesella, who is the president of the NCGR and a professional astrologer in New York. And today we're going to be talking about some different facets of Saturn and how to understand Saturn within your birth chart and within the sky. So welcome, John. How are you?
Great. Thanks a lot.
Good. Thanks for being on the channel today.
Good.
Good. Yeah. So, we got in contact via email and we settled on the topic of Saturn. Saturn's an important planet in my chart. It's right on the Ascendant. I spend a lot of time contemplating Saturn and as a Vedic astrologer, doing remedial measures for Saturn. So I'm kind of curious, from your perspective, from your angle of the work you do, how do you typically come at Saturn? How do you approach Saturn within a person's chart?
Well, I think that Saturn really is all about time.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the Greek name for Saturn is Chronos,
Right.
which is the Greek word for time. That's where we get the root of chronological, chronic, and old crony, even crone and crown are words that are all associated with Saturn, actually. So whether we're talking about his transits,
Mm-hmm.
his transits really just make happen whatever was bound to happen with time,
Right.
whatever was a matter of time. One day I knew this day would come, and now here it is.
Mm-hmm.
I could see this coming a mile away. When we're honest with ourselves, those really are the expressions that we use during Saturn transits.
Right.
I don't think that he surprises us. It's great to predict with Saturn because he's so predictable.
Right. Yeah.
And in the natal chart, I think it's the Saturn area of life that particularly humanizes us.
Mm-hmm.
It's what teaches us what comes with the human condition, which is mainly about time.
Right.
Time ultimately is the God that all human beings have to answer to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So when you're looking at a person's chart and you're finding Saturn in a particular sign or in a particular house, just as an example, how might you kind of couch that? Like what would you say to someone if you saw Saturn in their 10th or Saturn in their 9th? How do you approach it in that regard?
Keep realistic expectations.
Okay.
Be patient.
Mm-hmm.
This is the area of life that might humble us, especially when we're young.
Right.
This might be where we're going to be a late bloomer.
Mm-hmm.
And every once in a while, we actually see somebody bloom early in the Saturn area of life and have their success or their achievement. But often what happens then is that they might lose it
Mm-hmm.
or it kind of goes away. And then it comes back a second time in another form.
Right.
And the second time is a little more authentic, a little more genuine, a little more self-made. That's some of the patience that comes with Saturn also.
All right, because the person's had more experience
Exactly.
coming at it. Okay.
I think what Saturn really does, both the natal Saturn as well as the transiting,
Right.
it really just manifests the natal potential.
Right.
And, they say that Saturn gets easier when you're older,
Mm-hmm.
which actually, now that I'm older, I don't think it does.
Yeah.
But what does happen is that when you get older, you get more familiar with what your potential is.
Right.
And therefore, you're more on track
Mm-hmm.
with that. And if that's what Saturn is going to make happen, then that's what you get.
Right.
When we're young, the ego is strong enough and foolish enough to think that our potential might be something other than what it is.
Mm.
That big job, that big house, that big love, or whatever.
Right.
When it's not really our potential, Saturn keeps knocking us away from it.
Mm-hmm.
And we often have to settle for what seems is less until actually we realize, oh, this other thing, not the big job, not the big house, this other thing is really me.
Right.
It's my potential. And we just get more familiar with what that is, hopefully.
Right. So, in Vedic astrology, oftentimes Saturn is treated as our limitations, our liabilities, death, and these sorts of things. I'm assuming it's probably the same in other traditions. So, when you're looking at Saturn, would you say that the area of life that Saturn is influencing is kind of bringing you into alignment with what your actual limitations are? So it's kind of knocking out your expectations or helping you make peace with those limitations. Does that sound good?
That's definitely one way to say it. But in making us aware of what our limitations are, what our potential is not,
right.
By doing that, it clarifies where our freedom is and what our potential really is.
Right. Okay.
It's just that when we're younger, we tend to focus on the limitation instead of what is there instead.
Right. Yeah. And, sometimes I've been told that Saturn is, well, by many people, that Saturn is the planet of greatness. And, I've thought about that a lot because, as we've been discussing, Saturn does bring you into alignment with what your limitations are, what your potential is. But it's also a planet that can show a place where you need to work hard.
Oh, yeah.
Right? Where you need to put a lot of attention to develop that.
Sure.
Yeah. So if you saw Saturn, like, for example, in someone's seventh house, right? And you have to forgive me if I'm not using the right terminology. All I know really is Western or Vedic astrology. So I'm not familiar with how it's approached from the Western mindset, but I'm assuming it's the same thing. If Saturn's in the seventh, that's going to put more attention towards relationships, how you relate to others, and the things with that. So how do you interpret that, or how would you see that as an example? The seventh house in Saturn.
Well, a number of ways. The most obvious and the most common is, I can't get into a relationship that I want. And instead we need to accept. With Saturn, a lot of it is just acceptance and again, patient. And maybe it's not going to be the relationship that you want, but what kind of relationship is being delivered to you? Maybe it's not with the right guy or the right woman.
Right.
Maybe it's someone from a very different world, from off your beaten path. Maybe it's someone who's very different than yourself, and you might feel a little uncomfortable with that. You might even feel a little limited by the fact that it's someone maybe who's a different race, color, creed, maybe someone who's of a different age category, maybe who lives out of town or something like that. But that might be, in accepting those limitations, that might be what actually opens you up to the real experience of love.
Right.
And it's sometimes in that way too that we see then the Saturn rulership of Aquarius in Western astrology, and I assume it's the same with that it rules both Capricorn and Aquarius. And when Saturn brings us something that is just different, odd, off the beaten path, from out of my world, and we awaken to it, then that's actually Saturn ruling Aquarius.
Right. Okay. So then Saturn in Aquarius, and then Saturn in Capricorn, that would be the more hard work effort side of things. Right. Okay. All right. So whenever you work with people and you're trying to help them understand their chart, I'm assuming you probably spend a lot of time on Saturn. Is that correct?
Sure. Yeah.
Okay. And how have you found the best way to relate the experiences and the understanding of Saturn to your clients, to the people you work with, in such a way that they're able to actually hear it? Because a lot of times when I talk to people, when I talk about Saturn, all they hear is, this is the problem. They don't necessarily hear and this is how you can help to work with it to mature through it. So how do you approach that? If you don't mind.
Let's see, there are two answers to your question. Especially if we're talking about the natal Saturn.
Right.
This is the purpose of the problem. This is the purpose that the problem is solving.
Okay.
And if you can understand the purpose, then it helps to be more accepting of it. You realize it's playing a role in your life, that it's not something that is not supposed to be there. When you realize that it has a purpose, there's nothing the matter then. There's nothing wrong. That's supposed to be there. And then it gets a little bit easier to work with.
Right.
Saturn by transit, I usually start the reading by saying, this is the time that you're in.
Right. Okay.
Your second house. Then it's time, well, in Western astrology, it's very based on the seasons.
Yeah.
And the quadrants would be each of the 4 seasons.
Right.
So if we just take Saturn's transit through the houses and through the quadrants, we know what season we're in, then we know what task we have.
Right. Okay. So you would follow, say, Saturn in a particular sign, and then you would relate that to the individual, and that this is what they're supposed to focus on. This is where the responsibility is. Is that
right?
Okay. Okay. And
the second house, for instance, I take as, second house is naturally associated with Taurus.
Right.
And that means the planting season. It's time to plant seeds. This is the time to buy your starter house. This is the time to go back to school. This is the time to start your business. And you're not starting from the top down. You're planting seeds. You're starting from the ground up.
Okay.
And then as Saturn goes through the other houses and quadrants, then we just follow the theme of the seasons, and each season has a task.
Okay. So Saturn being like tropical Sagittarius right now. When I think of that from, my training, it's higher education, getting involved in things like law and, higher ideals and spiritual growth, these sorts of things. So having Saturn transiting that area, like how do you look at that? Would it be similar things, or are there other aspects to it to consider?
Well, I would match it to the house that it's in.
Oh, the house that it's in. Right. Okay. So we're not just looking at signs, we're also putting it into the chart.
Right. For the individual, we'll see more of a concrete manifestation first through the house and then through the sign.
I see. Okay.
Whereas
excellent.
If we're working with mundane astrology, with the astrology of the world, then we can see the planet more clearly through the signs. So for instance, with Saturn and Sagittarius right now, it's one of the reasons why immigration, for instance, is such a hot button issue.
Right.
Not only in this country, but really around the world.
Right. And I guess, we also, at least from the Vedic perspective, attribute it to like political things. So, I mean, does that follow the same kind of pattern with the Western Sagittarius? Is that political as well? Yes. So that put a lot of attention, as we see now, on like the political process and these sorts of things?
Absolutely.
Gotcha. Okay.
Very specifically, very pointedly.
Yeah.
Would be what's going on with the Supreme Court right now.
Right.
Sagittarius in the Western system is generally the legal system, specifically the Supreme Court.
Excellent. Yeah. All right. That makes sense. Good. So one final thing, I have a question about for you, is the idea of the Saturn return. Okay. A lot of people ask about this. They talk about this, and, we go through maybe 3, possibly 4, if we're lucky, but usually 3 in a lifetime. So when you see someone going through a Saturn return, Saturn's coming back into that sign, what are the thoughts you have around that? How do you, counsel the person in that regard when they get to that point?
Well, with the first Saturn return, it's my favorite expression is, this is the death of the child, so that the adult can be born.
Right.
The end of an era, the beginning of a new era. The second Saturn return, by the way, I say this is the end of the adult, the death of the adult, and this is the birth, hopefully, of the older, wiser person.
Right.
And in a nutshell, the first Saturn return, any person, place, or thing that no longer serves a purpose in your future is just dead weight, is no longer fulfilling a promise, then that just falls to the wayside by choice or by force.
Right.
And whatever comes into your life or whatever remains in your life demands a deeper commitment.
Right. Do you find that when people go through those Saturn returns that, if it's about growing up, it's about letting go of the child, that if a person isn't quite ready or doesn't quite know how to move into that role of maturity, that's obviously a little more difficult for them? I mean, I've seen that happen. I'm curious what your experience is with that.
Absolutely. And let's not overestimate it either, because if everybody totally grew up at 9 years old, then everyone would be awfully responsible in their 30s and their 40s. Things like learned. And it's not to say that just because you grow up around your first Saturn return, it's not to say that innocence does not return. Innocence, definitely, spring will always come back. But yes, if people are in any way resistant for whatever reason. Resistant fear, resistant they're spoiled brats, resistant because they're so attached to childhood.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the Saturn return then gets a little bit harder for them.
Mm-hmm.
My teacher used to say, you can go through this voluntarily or you can go kicking and screaming, but you're going to go through this.
Right. Yeah, understandable. When it comes to the Saturn return, is there a way to see in the chart whether it is going to be easier, or they are going to take it a little more seriously, or is it really just up to how the person has lived their life?
Well, that's a good question. To the individual, it's always going to be hard.
Right. Okay.
And you can say to one client, yeah, but you're not going to have it as hard as the guy who was here this morning. He's going to have it really hard.
Yeah.
So this client right now would say, I don't care how hard he's going to have it.
Right.
My hardness is my hardness.
Yeah.
But, the trick in that has a lot to do with the natal setup. And this is true actually for all transits.
Okay.
All else being equal, the transit is really only as difficult as the natal experience of the transiting planet.
Okay.
So if your Saturn is, let's say, in a grand square,
mm-hmm.
and then you go through your Saturn return, then yeah, yours is going to be more difficult because Saturn is returning to a grand square.
Right.
So the potential for that is much more challenging than if you have Saturn in a grand trine.
Mm-hmm.
Manifesting the potential of a grand trine, relatively speaking, mm-hmm. is much easier, even though it's still going to be hard for that person.
Right. I see.
So, sobering is a good word to use.
Yes, certainly. Okay, good. Well, that's excellent. I guess I do have one more question if you have time for it.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, so from the Vedic perspective, there's this idea called the Sati period, which is when Saturn transits over the moon. And a lot of people put a lot of weight on this as though this is an extremely difficult time period, like your world's going to fall apart. They even treat it a little more harshly than I would say the Saturn return. So is there anything likened to that in Western astrology, or is it just a simple fact that Saturn's going over the moon that would make it difficult? Does that question make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I've got two answers to that. I think any transit to the moon, by conjunction or by square, in my experience, by a hard planet, Uranus, Neptune, Pluto, Saturn, is going to be very hard because, and again, it's all relative to the natal condition, but the moon is where you're vulnerable. The moon is where you're open.
Right.
So that's where we're going to be. So if there's a difficult transit there, you're going to let in, you're going to be open, you're going to be vulnerable to the transit. Mm-hmm. And the moon is where you have protection. That's the mother. Mm-hmm. And the mothering principle will be combated or overshadowed by the difficult planet.
Right. So
indeed, one of my favorite expressions for Saturn transiting the moon is to be a motherless child. So that indeed is a very difficult time as well. But I don't know if this is true in all Western astrology, but it's certainly true in my work and what I learned. Saturn over the Ascendant is the very challenging time that sounds like how Saturn on the moon is in astrology, because Saturn on the Ascendant represents the end of your life as you've known it and the beginning of a new life. And it's often something that hits you, well, from the blind spot of the 12th house. Out of nowhere, bang, there's something that really gets you and shatters the illusions that you didn't even know that you were living in the 12th house. And you have a rude awakening to reality. And that often makes us feel very infant-like. Right. Start of all things.
That makes sense. And I'm always curious about the idea we were talking about, the Sati, because personally I have found that what you just said was that it's that transit of Saturn over the Ascendant, which actually seems to give more of the experience than when we see Saturn going over the moon. Right. So that's good. And it gives me some confirmation there in that regard. I always like to see how systems overlap because it seems to me that when the system overlaps, that there's where we're going to find like a truth in astrology. Because personally, I think astrology is just astrology. I don't think it's Vedic, Eastern, or Western. I think there's, it can be tied together in a certain way. So yeah, great. All right. Well, I appreciate you taking the time to speak with me today about Saturn. I'll post this up on the YouTube channel, and maybe sometime down the road we could do another talk or another little short snippet on another topic of your choosing that you're passionate about.
Absolutely. I'd love to.
All right. Well, thank you very much, John. We'll be in touch.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Yeah.